On one side of me is sea, on the other side is land. In the middle is a dirty great nuclear reactor. I'm on the North Somerset coast next to Hinkley Point. Now when Hinkley Point, which is under reconstruction at the moment, reopens, it's going to need to pump seawater, and that's going to have a bad effect on sea fish. How bad an effect? Well, our brilliant government has come up with a number. It's going to have a bad effect on 800 acres of fish. So what our brilliant government proposes is that EDF, the owner of Hinkley Point, offsets that by flooding 800 acres of land with seawater. Yes, EDF, one of Europe's largest companies, is going to re-sea North Somerset.
What we're looking at is the Poolard Hams, a great area of both grazing land and used for arable, and of course full of livestock, and traditionally some of the best grazing land in the country, and for us taking it away and creating a salt marsh which will not enhance the fish population will just be an absolute nonsense. It's a greenwashing, it's ticking of boxes, it's political correctness at its worst.
This is offsetting. Back in the 1970s it was called mitigation. You may have come across people with environmental science degrees doing nicely out of bat hotels and great crested newt water parks where wildlife wiped out by development is replaced with the same species elsewhere. On the face of it, it makes sense. Many people believe that hedgehogs should be on council housing lists. But flounders and mullet?
This is supposed to be a fish breeding enterprise, which none of us, including their good selves, dare I say it, have got much faith in. Because if you talk to EDF, and it was a pity we couldn't have them here today, you'll find that when you start talking about the fish, they get very quiet and they look rather shamefaced in my view. So I think you'll find the whole thing is a tick boxing exercise.
I think the surveyors came from London, hadn't actually ever been on site, so they didn't actually know what they were doing. But.
Yeah, I mean, Neil, you've been at the heart of government. This sort of planning by Google Maps, does it really take place?
I think it does. You see, George Eustace, just before he retired as minister, for DEFRA, he was the one who signed this one off and said, you are going to reduce the fish population in the Bristol Channel, so you have to have mitigation. And so they ticked a box and they said, right, okay, we'll find 800 acres. They come to the Hams. They were East London consultants. They were coming around, they had notices on our land. They didn't come and consult us first. The first thing we knew of it is when, outside of our house, we came back one night and there were 2 or 3 posters nailed to the fence saying that they were going to take the land, and we thought they were going to take it right back to our farms and beyond. We even had one in a field we've got running to the village, which is 100 feet above sea level. I did decide that we'd need quite a long big snorkel where we're living if they were going to flood that one. They had no idea what they were doing, and when I tackled a couple of these guys, I apologised to them afterwards for being so blunt, but I said, you don't know what you're doing. And they said, well, you seem to have all got together around here. And I said, well, yes, we have, because we've lived here a very long time. And we, for 4 generations, our families have been here. We're not going to just let you roll us over. And they didn't have a clue where the land was.
I think they had trouble mainly because the land hadn't been sold for 100 years. So there's no records of who owns it. That was what they were struggling with. So they put all their little letters down saying who owns this land, and nobody would tell them.
Well, not only did you have to say whether you owned it, you had to say whether you had a mortgage on it, and all of these details. Well, look, I'm sorry, I don't sort of just reply to somebody's letter in the post, do I have a mortgage on this? And farmers over the years, we're quite private over our finances, and we like to keep a lot of that to ourselves. And I think the whole thing was so badly handled, and I think what it's done is it's upset upset everybody. But I think the trouble is the one, they've wound us right up by the way they started doing it, and two, they haven't proven their case, because this is a material change, you see, to their original planning permission. So it will need to go before an inspector in Bristol. And I do hope that the inspector, he or she, does actually get EDF to explain what they're doing, and will they be able to replace this land if they flood it with salt water, because they're destroying so much good farmland, so much wildlife. We had a guy from the CLA, Country Landowners Association. He came to see us and he made the point that they will have to replace this land elsewhere, and I think they're cooling off this land quite quickly, but we will see.
I did talk to EDF. They didn't want to be filmed. Chris Fayers, Hinkley Point C's Head of Environment, gave me a statement which I've put in full in the description below this film. He starts by saying that Hinkley Point C is working with Natural England, Natural Resources Wales, the Environment Agency and other conservation bodies to develop new natural habitats to compensate for the risk of any impact on protected fish species. There is a strong hint that Neil's reading of the situation is correct. Chris does make the observation that power stations have been taking cooling water from the Bristol Channel for decades with no significant impact on fish populations. And he points to scientific evidence that the remaining impact on fish is very small. Those statements could be read as the environmental equivalent of saying, "I was only acting under orders." What the government agencies are asking EDF to do is to flood 800 acres of pasture with seawater. The media often gets muddled about which bit of Somerset is which. The county has hills and it has low-lying land drained by engineers from the Dark Ages onwards, notably by the Dutch in the 17th century. The drainage plan is spectacular. Most winters, by design, water floods the Somerset moors, which are several miles inland, here filmed from a train window. Those are what the media photograph and mistakenly refer to as the Somerset levels. The water drains from the moors via drains called reens through the Somerset levels and into the sea. What people locally mainly complain about is the speed of that drainage.
It doesn't flood a lot because we've got all the reens and it's fairly high ground anyway, but we've also got 5 outlets around the hams where it's only got to go 100 yards to the sea.
This is where the ditches go out to sea,
out through the river bank.
It's like a flapper basically, and it's a simple flapper. When the fresh water is higher, it pushes the flapper open. When the salt water comes in from the river, it pushes the flapper shut and stops the salt water coming in. It put in by the Dutch engineers 300-400 years ago. Really very simple, very clever, and it does keep these hams pretty dry. I mean, they get wet when it's a very wet time, but they don't flood like Sedgemoor, because we don't have to pump here, you see. We don't have to rely upon the Environment Agency to decide to turn on the pumps, and they always turn them on far too late. But I'm only making a particular political point there, which I've been at war with them for years over.
Philip, calm him down.
Yeah.
Takes some doing, doesn't it?
It does.
Yeah.
Sedgemoor is probably 5 miles the other side of Bridgewater,
Yeah.
and the sea is 100 yards that way.
So the water off Sedgemoor, which is the one we see on the news, comes straight past you?
Yes, some of it comes past us, but the majority of it actually goes to the new cut at Highbridge, further on again.
So another of the big drains, really.
Yeah.
But the point is, it's designed not to stop. That's the key.
It is, and of course you see Environment Agency over the years, I always thought, wanted the hams eventually as a sort of floodplain where they might be able to flood it on the odd occasion if they have a huge tides and huge problems. The problem with this scheme is that once they've flooded it with salt water, you can't flood it a second time. And so I think it's very interesting from a conservation point of view, from Natural England and Environment Agency. They're not that enthusiastic about it, but they're a bunch of wimps, and they're not saying that in public. But in private, I think they are probably saying a lot more.
Following a tidal surge in 1981, the government built banks around much of this coast to hold back the sea. The new idea is to breach those ramparts and dig a river to allow the seawater to come in. Now, if you think that EDF's hands are tied, have a look at who's doing the tying. It's the conservation industry, with government conservation bodies such as Natural England and Natural Resources Wales on one side, and the RSPB and the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust on the other. Go back 10 years and WWT led a project to create a salt marsh on land on the other side of the River Parrett from Neil and Philip. This is the view that the conservation industry provides of the breach in the embankment that goes around Steert marshes. Now in 2014 they made a big hole in the embankment here, and in 2015 they were proud to discover that the whole 260 hectare area flooded to a depth of 1.5 metres, and now they're proud to report they've got rid of almost all of that awful pasture and replaced it with salt marsh grasses which attract birds. While I was filming at Steert, I bumped into a local farmer who has a chicken unit and beef cattle on the seaward side of the Steert ramparts. He is positive about the effect the salt marsh has had on his side of the river.
Possibly my views are slightly different to others. We run a poultry farm, so didn't at the time when this project was being talked about, we don't have much land down in Steert. We were very vulnerable to flooding from the sea and the river. I think number one option for us before the marshes were created is if you built a big bank all the way around the outside, but being realistic, we sort of understood that there wasn't going to be money for that. So lots of consultation all the way through with us and other farmers in the area. I guess we were slightly, as a business, slightly more positive towards it because it gave us a little bit more security at the time from the river bank, which was one of the weaker defences.
And as it works out?
For us, yeah, given us longevity, obviously there's pros and cons to everything. We've got more visitors coming down and visit the marshes. Personally, again, I don't see that as quite such a much as an issue as other people, but we're not running up and down the road quite like other people, other farmers in the area. So again, you might have a different view from them. You didn't actually lose any land? No.
So for the people who lost land, what's happened to them?
So some farmers lost a lot of land, a couple of 100 acres, sort of cut their farm really down by, I mean, you lose a couple of 100 acres, that's a big thing for you, isn't it? Obviously there's compensation, but I don't think that quite matches the land prices around, so struggled, and then other things happen, and I think they've gone on to diversify. Other farmers had more land which had an opportunity to go off and possibly buy elsewhere, sort of looking at as from a person who could have lost his, I would have loved to sold the lot and escape really, but for us that wasn't an option.
And if you fancy Somerset salt marsh beef, visit Andy's website and he will sell you a box. Link below. He'd have to sell a lot of beef boxes to match the funding that goes to salt marshes, which scientists have ruled are more effective than trees for storing carbon. Once something gets that designation, there's no stopping the conservation industry. Look out anywhere in the UK that's low-lying, from the 170,000 acres of the Somerset moors and levels to the 70,000 acres of the Norfolk and Suffolk Broads, and the big one, the 400,000 acres of fenland. They could all be reseed. In 2023, insurance company Aviva paid the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust £21 million for creating and managing the Steert Reserve and other projects around the UK. WWT gets grant money and it gets habitat. It scored another £800,000 of taxpayers' money for Steert earlier this year, which followed the £1.58 million it got in 2021. And it was the government that paid more than £20 million for Steert back in the early 2010s. Aviva gets flood defences, which will reduce its insurance payouts, and it gets to look lovely and nature-friendly too. Currently underway is an offset plan by the Bristol Port Company to hand the RSPB 500 acres of land next to Steert for more reseeing. That much cash is hard to lobby against. Back to Neil and Philip. It's the uncertainty that's eating them at the moment.
My mother's got dementia, early stages of dementia. She owns some of the ground down here. We actually haven't told her at all. All the press she was getting, you know, post or whatever, She didn't understand, so we've managed to stop that. Everything is now sent to me. We've stopped that, so she doesn't know anything about it. Because yeah, she's probably one of the worst cases, but it also affected people that's just got a house in Stretchholt. They also said, your house is of interest to us.
That's right.
Because that's what they had to do for the planning. When they were putting in for their planning or going to put in for their planning to say what they were going to, they had to tell us they were interested in the land. And that's the first correspondence we had. So that's a big shock.
It is. You see,
So most people, if somebody says, we're interested in your house,
Yeah.
and they ask the same question, have you got a mortgage on it? Do you rent it? Do you own it?
Yeah. I mean, my wife, you know, we've been married now 43 years, and she loves it here. And she put a lot of her money into the place when we were, you know, she was teaching and I was farming. And so, you know, I mean, she's really part of this. I mean, she got really upset, you know, and I said, well, look, calm down, we will sort of fight this. And I suspect once it settles, it probably won't be. Because we thought, you see, we were going to have water right up to the main road, really, right up all out through Stretchholt, because that again was so badly handled. Now, the part of the politician in me says, well, what they were doing was frightening us all to death, and we'll take all of that. And then he said, well, no, all right, chaps, you know, and chapesses, we're not going to have all that. We'll just have the hams, you know. Now, whether that, but I don't think it was. I think it was a complete cock up. I think
Neil is no slouch when it comes to political campaigning. You can find out more about the Protect Paulet Hams campaign via the link below. I think one of the things I find most surprising about this is that farmland is farmed by farmers and wildland is looked after by gamekeepers, yet most of the money here has gone to bird watchers.